Hello, readers by eyes and by ears. This is Mari Chan, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are continuing with the reading of Stars of Chaos, Volume 4, also known as Chapelang by Priest, and we're moving into Arc 13, Government Reforms. Today we're covering chapters 95 through 97, so I hope you all enjoy. Arc 13, Government Reforms. Chapter 95, A Sudden Catastrophe. No one slept that night. The Liu clan and their faction were swiftly snapped up and sent to jail to await trial. Fang Qin and his allies had performed a meritorious deed in saving the emperor. Though they had narrowly avoided any assignation of guilt, the results were far from what they had planned. They, too, were left in a sorry state. Meanwhile, Prince Yan, the eye of this hurricane, was still missing. No one knew whether he was dead or alive. The grand assembly that had been set to meet the next day was cancelled last minute as members of the Imperial Academy of Medicine scurried in and out of the palace like ants on a hot plate. Guyuan and Shen Yi remained in the palace through the night. They didn't leave until early the next morning, shrouded in the cool morning dew of early autumn. Guyuan could still smell the medicinal brews that suffused the inner palace chambers. He had a sensitive nose and found joy in all sorts of scents. The sweet yet uncloying perfume of rouge and powder on a beauty skin, the full and vivacious scent of greenery on a midsummer day, the fresh and peaceful fragrance of herbal incense on a certain handsome young man. The one scent he detested was the scent of medicine, especially when it was stagnant, shut inside a room with doors and windows sealed, lingering obstinately in the air like a swamp that threatened to swallow one whole. The two walked side by side. After such an ordeal, both were exhausted and neither spoke. Shen Yi waited until they exited the palace gates to break the silence in tones of worry. "How are your eyes?" Guyuan shook his head. Shen Yi didn't know if he was shaking his head to mean nothing's wrong with them or not so good. Figuring Guyuan had no one at home to care for him, he instructed his driver to take them to his own estate. The curfew had yet to be lifted, and not a soul traveled the Bluestone Road with them. When Shen Yi lifted the curtain, the only sound was the clack of carriage wheels rolling over stone. Shen Yi heaved a weary sigh and adjusted the gas lamp swaying above their heads. The gas lamp casted mottled shadows over Guyuan's face. There were dark smudges below his eyes, and his cheeks were slightly hollowed. Guyuan had crossed his arms and leaned against the side of the carriage to rest his eyes the moment he climbed inside. He didn't even ask Shen Yi where he was taking him. When the carriage reached his home, Shen Yi finally nudged Guyuan awake. He had fallen asleep during the brief ride. He opened his eyes groggily, only awakening fully after stepping out of the carriage into the cool breeze. He squinted at the Shun estate's gates. "There was so much going on last night. Did I hear someone say Old Master Shun is ill?" Shen Yi coughed awkwardly. He couldn't exactly spill the beans right there on the street, so he threw Guyuan a meaningful look and twisted his face into a smile. Guyuan caught on at once. "I've come to visit someone on his sickbed, but I didn't even bring a gift." "Don't worry about it," Shen Yi laughed dryly. "You were generous enough to bring his son back to him in one piece." You! Shut up!" This last was directed at the enigmatic door guardian hanging before the Shun estate's gate. The Mino was in a good mood today and hadn't planned on making any trouble. It was only stretching its neck to observe Guyuan with curiosity, but found itself scolded the moment it fluttered its wings. Overcome with avian rage, it began to welcome the guests with an ear-splitting screech. "Beast! Little beast! Bad luck written all over your face! Die today! Get buried tomorrow!" This great ancestor was loyal only to Old Master Shun. Whenever it saw him, it was good fortune and wealth to the Old Master. Yet it treated all other two-legged creatures like stupid bastards come to pick a fight. Guyuan was unfazed. This wasn't his first time getting cussed out. He curled his fingers and with a well-practiced flick, a brush of wind smacked the bird across the beak. The myna tumbled off its perch, feathers scattering across the floor on its cage. Faced with a stronger foe, it immediately deflated. After a mute moment, it creaked out in a thin and woe-begone voice. "Good fortune to my husband! May you rank in the imperial examinations!" General Shan had half a mind to crawl into a very deep hole. Guyuan laughed as he stepped forward to enter the courtyard. As soon as his back was turned, the bird's attitude flipped as fast as the pages of a book. "Pa! Pa!" it spat. By all the laws of common sense, a grown adult weighing several dozen kilograms had no reason to stoop to the level of a feather duster weighing several dozen grams. Unfortunately, the Marquis of Order bowed to no law. He swiftly stepped back, plucked the birdcage from the gate rafters, and prized the door guardian from its iron shelter. "Tell your old man I'm taking this brute with me. I'll gift him a new one another day." Shen Yi had long detested the animal. He nearly shed tears of gratitude. "Of course, no problem. No thanks could be enough for this greatest of favors," he assured him. The terrified door guardian puffed itself into a ball. "A wife killing her own husband! Ka!" Guyuan had grabbed it by the neck. The shriek awoke the old guard dozing by the gate. Rubbing his eyes to find Guyuan standing before the house, he hurried over to welcome their guest in another flurry of activity. Once they entered the inner courtyard, Shen Yi scanned the area and ensured they were alone. "Where is His Highness Prince Yan?" he finally asked in a low voice. Slowly, Guyuan shook his head. "You don't know either?" Shen Yi was shocked. "We lost contact in Yangzhou." Still grasping the bird in one hand, Guyuan used the other to pinch the space between his brows so hard it left a mark. He briefly recounted their southward journey to Shanyi. He had Xiao Cao impersonate him and meet with Yang Rongui while he infiltrated the city in secret. One of the guards I left with him said he sought out a Jianghu faction, looking for refugees to serve as witnesses. He sent a few lines assuring me he was doing well and not to worry, and said I should return to the capital. There's been nothing since. Yang Rongui went and committed treason in his name, so what could I do but return to smooth things over for him? I left a few men behind and asked General Zhong to send some people to investigate quietly. But things are still... After all this ruckus, things were still up in the air. Shen Yi didn't know what to say. He patted Guyuan on the shoulder. "You know how capable Prince Yan is. Look, he didn't even bother to show his face during this mess. He must have been prepared for it. I'm sure all's well. He's been traveling to Jianghu and running this way and that across the country with Zhong Lao and the others since he was young. What hasn't he seen by now? It'll be all right." Guyuan's furrowed brow showed no sign of smoothing. Shen Yi tried a change of topic. "How is His Majesty?" "He wasn't injured, at least," Guyuan said with a sigh. "The imperial physicians say he made himself sick with fury and needs to convalesce. But let's be honest. I've heard the word convalesce so many times my ears have grown calluses. Don't these doctors have anything else to suggest? If we had the time to take it easy, who wouldn't?" "Did he say anything when he called you in?" Shen Yi cautiously asked. Guyuan was silent a moment. "He did. He asked me, if rain pours in torrents and the river floods its banks, will a flood dragon grow horns?" Shen Yi's breath caught in his throat. A flood dragon growing horns foretold its transformation into an imperial dragon. The implication was crystal clear. I said, flood or imperial dragons are always closely related to folk legends. They can command the clouds, summon rain, and nourish the land. In this regard, they are alike. But though a flood dragon is a divine creature, if it caused the river to swell without regard for the banks just so it might grow horns and become an imperial dragon, would it not be merely another evildoer? Any dragon capable of it would surely be a wicked creature with a long record of crimes against the people. "That's what you said to His Majesty?" In truth, Li Feng had said more. The emperor was in his prime, but as he leaned against the head of the bed, he possessed an air of an aged man in his twilight years. He had abruptly asked Guyuan, "What did the late emperor tell you before he passed?" The late emperor had said quite a lot. To this day, Guyuan could still remember every word. He thought it over for a moment before picking the safest excerpt. His late Majesty instructed this subject thusly: "Doing too much is as bad as doing too little. Remember to appreciate your good fortune and know when it's appropriate to advance and when to retreat." Li Feng started in surprise, then turned to face the awakening light of dawn. He repeated the words, "Too much is as bad as too little," a few times, then said, seemingly out of nowhere, "Amin told us he was abused by that barbarian woman as a child. Uncle, did you know?" Guyuan was 120% on guard, yet he was still thrown by this remark. What was Li Feng driving at? Outside the window, a little bird snapped a branch beneath its feet and fluttered off into the sky in fright. Pulled out of his trance, the dazed expression faded from Li Feng's exhausted face. He looked back at Guyuan, gaze full of unspoken words, but in the end, he said nothing more. Guyuan was dismissed with a wave of his imperial hand. Shen Yi sighed. The heart of a ruler is inscrutable, and the hearts of people are inscrutable too. At this, Guyuan too came back to the present. "I'm tired." "That's only to be expected," Shen Yi empathized very much. Those with no regard for the law, the cornered dogs jumping desperately at the walls, those taking advantage of the chaos to fish in muddy waters. It's worse than fighting a war at the border passes. Honestly, I was most at ease when I was but an artificer in the Lingshu Institute. Zishi, sometimes I feel like this capital city is a cavern full of man-eating demons, with danger lurking around every corner. Why don't we drop everything and run? We'll find ourselves a place to set up a little shop together, just enough to keep us fed. We won't have to bow to anyone's whims. What should we sell? Artificer's tools and engine oil? What do you say? Are you daft? Guyuan rolled his eyes. Dousing yourself in grease every day and serving a bunch of stinking customers as greasy as yourself? I refuse. If I'm selling anything, it'll be rouge and powder. Now that wouldn't be so bad. Watching a stream of beautiful women come in and out all day. This immediately stirred Shen Yi's sanctimonious heart. Does Prince Yan know about these grand ambitions of yours? He asked with a fake smile. Guyuan chuckled along with him, but quickly found himself unable to laugh. He didn't expend much effort hiding his worries around Shen Yi. Where was Chang'eng now? Even if he returned unscathed, what should they say to Li Feng? After this incident, could these brothers continue as before, without any friction between them? Looking on, Shen Yi saw how Guyuan couldn't even feign nonchalance as soon as the topic turned to Prince Yan. He had never seen Guyuan so serious about anyone. Shen Yi was shocked and a bit afraid to follow this line of conversation to its end. Social customs had seen no little turmoil in recent years. In some places, people had become extremely open-minded, taking after the far Westerners and throwing aside strict barriers between men and women. At the same time, many of the scholarly, aristocratic families clung more tightly to old ways, howling about the collapse of social etiquette. The restrictions they placed on their own sons and daughters grew harsher still. Somehow, Shen Yi felt both extremes were rather heartless. The former had couples growing fond of each other in 3 days and breaking apart in 2 more, brushing aside the directives of their parents and the arrangements of their matchmaker. And yet, who didn't have selfish concerns about the major affair that was their own marriage? Even if no one else tended to this matter, the bride and groom would run their own calculations. In the end, most ended up holding their noses and settling for someone well matched to their own station. The trouble with the latter went without saying. The compulsion to marry at an appropriate age was an obligation born of mindlessly following ancient rules of etiquette, forcibly binding 2 people who had nothing in common together for a lifetime. It was scarcely different from animal husbandry. Finding true love and conjugal bliss was a stroke of luck as rare as a blind cat running across a dead mouse. There was only so much deep affection in the world. Madmen claimed some, and fools claimed some more. How could the handful of leftovers be enough for everyone to share? A pair like Prince Yan and Guyuan were truly a rare sight. The 2 of them didn't flaunt their feelings around others, but Shen Yi understood Guyuan. If Guyuan could let go, he would never have overstepped the line of their godfather-godson relationship. The very thought alarmed Shen Yi. His mother-hen instincts flared again. "Zishi," he began quietly, "I'm not trying to curse you, but have you considered what you'll do if something comes between the 2 of you in the future?" Guyuan was silent for a long while. This time, he didn't dodge the subject. Not until they had nearly reached the rear courtyard did Gu Yuan finally speak, his voice so low as to be nearly inaudible. I have. I don't know. For once, Shen Yi didn't know what to say. The grandest declaration of love in the world would have been less shocking to him than these 5 words. They entered the rear courtyard to find old Master Shun, supposedly still confined to his bed, up and lively as he ran through some boxing exercises. He showed no sign of being on the verge of death. The old man was overjoyed to see Gu Yuan and promptly dragged him off to discuss his latest insights on healthy living. He even enthusiastically invited Marshal Gu to join him in a 2-person Tai Chi pushing routine. Afraid his overzealous old father would be pushed straight into the grave by General Gu, Shen Yi hastily deflected this invitation and ushered Gu Yuan inside to rest with cold sweat pouring down his forehead. Gu Yuan slept all the way through to the afternoon. He was still sleeping when Shen Yi barged inside and dragged him out of bed. His Majesty has summoned you to the palace. It's urgent. Thus, Gu Yuan rushed back to the palace. Upon arriving, he was shocked to find one of the guards he had assigned to Changgung's security detail. Travel-worn, injured, and blood-stained, the man had clearly withstood a long journey. Gu Yuan's heart galloped in his chest. Stiffly, he wet his lips, mastered his emotions, and greeted Li Feng with a hasty bow. Please rise, uncle. Face sallow with illness, Li Feng pushed himself up to a seated position and turned to the guard. Repeat what you said about Prince Yan. The guard bowed his head. This subordinate acted on the marshal's orders to protect His Highness Prince Yan and Commissioner Xu as they went in secret to investigate the plague in Jiangbei, he said to Gu Yuan. The traitor Yang Rongwei intended us ill, and we were on our way to the Jiangbei garrison with a message to that effect when we lost contact with Prince Yan. Later, when Yang Rongwei slipped away to head north, the marshal didn't know whether Prince Yan was detained or had escaped on his own. So, he took a group of men back to the capital to head them off. We were instructed to remain in Yangzhou Prefecture and search for Prince Yan. This was the story Gu Yuan had fed them ahead of time. In truth, Changgong had left the guards behind in Yangzhou Prefecture when he ventured into the territory of the Shanghai gang. Later, when Gu Yuan sped north to the capital, he had left the guards in Yangzhou out of concern for Changgong, with orders to search for the lost prince. Gu Yuan frowned. He had a bad feeling about what they'd hear next. The man Yang Rongwei had was fake, Li Feng interjected. Does this mean that you know Amin's location? The guard retrieved a letter from his lapels. Please read this, Your Majesty. The envelope was marked in Changgong's handwriting. The strokes were sloppy compared to his usual neat script, and the paper was stained with blood. Gu Yuan's fingertips went numb. He suddenly understood what Changgong had felt when he had bandaged Gu Yuan's injuries at the capital gates and said, I faint at the sight of your blood. Li Feng accepted the missive, his brow furrowing deeper the further he read. After a time, he sighed. He passed the letter to Gu Yuan without a word. Gu Yuan must have used all the strength in his body to hide how anxious and terrified he was. The letter was ordinary enough at the start, consisting of mostly nonsense, some fabulated tale about how Changgong had ingeniously escaped Yang Rongwei's clutches, leaving a double in his place. Later, he wrote he had fallen into the hands of the Shanghai gang, where he discovered some of the Jiangbei refugees had been secretly detained and persecuted by Yang Rongwei, while others had joined the local bandits. In order to gather witness testimony, Prince Yan had infiltrated the bandit gangs with Commissioner Xu. By now, Changgong must have that bookish fool Xu Ling wrapped around his little finger. The second half of the letter was where things began to go awry. Changgong recounted what he saw and heard in the Shanghai gang in a few brief strokes, including how Yang Rongwei had flouted the law to a truly astonishing degree. Yet, just as he had convinced a group of the bandits to follow him back to the capital for an audience with the emperor, conflict erupted within the Shanghai gang. Even if they had taken in helpless refugees, a gang bandit was a gang bandit. They had a natural hostility toward the government. Suspecting Prince Yan had in truth infiltrated the Shanghai gang to force their surrender, a few of the most ferocious bandits incited an argument that grew increasingly heated, until multiple factions within the gang were at each other's throats. Between the handful of instigators within the gang who loved to sow discord and the resentment many of the locals already had for the government, the situation quickly erupted into a full-on mob uprising. In his letter, Chang'e warned that although the mob looked threatening, they were limited in their engines and armor. They wouldn't hold out long against the proper army stationed at the Jiangbei garrison. However, to go that route would set the incident spiraling further out of control and intensify the antipathy of the people toward the emperor and his officials. Suppression by military force was the worst of all options. They should avoid bringing in the Jiangbei garrison for as long as possible. Chang'e closed by stating his intent to serve as a go-between in an attempt to win back the people and quell their anger. Here, Guyuan nearly flew into a murderous rage. What the hell kind of rubbish is this? This is what he calls doing well? Sorry. Sir, the guard spoke up again. His Highness gave us orders, so this subordinate dared not disobey. But the situation was growing increasingly tense. After Yang Rongwei left, the city defense troops under his command lacked a solid leader. The rebellious mob knocked them left and right. Many of the mob have friends who died at Yang Rongwei's hands. They hate the local government to the core. Their anger made them cruel, and they even tortured some of the captured soldiers to death. The situation was getting out of hand, so General Zhong sent me to bring an urgent report to the court and request imperial orders. Where is Amin? Li Feng asked. The guard fell to his knees. Your Majesty, His Highness Prince Yan. After His Highness delivered this letter through circuitous means, we never heard from him again. The one who snuck the letter out was a monk. His temple was burned down the very next day. Guyuan nearly choked on his next breath. Li Feng, too, was shocked stiff by this sequence of misfortunes. Chapter 96. Perilous Circumstances. When Chang'e opened his eyes, he found himself in complete darkness. The only nearby object reflecting a bit of light was Great Master Liao Zhan's bald head. The instant he twitched, a bedraggled Xu Ling launched himself to his side. Your Highness, he bawled. Your Highness, you're finally awake. Your Highness, do you recognize me? Your Highness. Within 3 sentences, Commissioner Xu had worked himself up to a sob. Like a filial son at an ailing parent's bedside, he mopped the tears from his face, only to find more taking their place. Unable to go on, he sat down a few paces away to wail and cry by his lonesome. Chang'e was at a loss for words. This ear-piercing melody was cut from the same demonic cloth as his General Gu's flute. Chang'e's ears buzzed from the racket. He felt more fortunate than ever that Great Master Liao Zhan was mute. The monk not only didn't squawk, he was even so considerate as to console the tear-sodden Commissioner Xu. Once Liao Zhan had calmed Xu Ling, he stepped over to Chang'e. We are close to the Jiangbei garrison. We should be safe here, he signed. I've released the wooden bird, and Sun Dage's young helper was able to contact the Jiangbei garrison with your Highness's token. Don't worry, as long as no other mishap occurs, General Zhong will be here soon. This monk loved acting mysterious and hated to bathe, but he was, after all, an accomplished disciple of the Lin Yuan Pavilion. Of the more than 360 days in a year, there were always 1 or 2 when he could be relied on. Chang'e nodded with some difficulty. After personally botching what should have been a straightforward mission, he couldn't help but laugh at himself. He ditched his guards and entered the Shanghai gang with Xu Ling in tow. Unfortunately, luck wasn't on his side. He had shown up at the worst possible time. No sooner had they reached Boss Suan's branch within the Shanghai gang on their way to the main headquarters than they ran straight into the motley crew that was the rebel mob moving out in full force. Chang'e's heart had thudded in his chest, but he hadn't been overly nervous. Given what he knew of Jiangbei, this rebellion was well within expectations. Cornered dogs would jump over walls, and even trapped rabbits would bite. Everyone knew treason was a high crime that condemned the traitor's kin to the 9th degree. But if a person's kin were already dead, and if they didn't know where they were going to get their next meal, if they were unable to scrape up even the most basic necessities for survival, What else could they do? Whether they died as a miserable wretch or a traitor, death was still death. So why not raise their banners in revolt? Even if they failed and found themselves beneath the executioner's knife, it wasn't as if they could be killed twice. At the very least, they would die for a cause and leave their names behind in history. The refugees who had fled captivity in Jiangbei had finally been pushed to the point of rebellion. But Chang'e was no deity. He could predict the refugees might revolt, but he couldn't pinpoint when and how they would do so. Thus, Chang'e only thought he had come at a bad time. What kinds of turmoil hadn't Prince Yan experienced before? He never considered he might lose control of the situation. Chang'e had been confident that the rebel mob of commoners revolting out of desperation would be easy to resolve. First of all, both the government and the rebels understood that, in the era of Violet Gold, a handful of martial experts capable of killing a man every 10 steps were not enough to carve out any real accomplishments in battle. Engines and armor were the key to victory. Even famed generals like Gu Yuan would run out of tricks when their supplies ran out. No matter how large an operation Jianghu bandits like the Shanghai gang ran, without engines, armor, and a Violet Gold supplier of their own, they were outmatched by the Jiangbei garrison. Revolt, then, was their way of demanding the government provide them a means of subsistence. Chang'e had been prepared to provide such means long before he arrived. The most ferocious, fearless person might still be swayed by a chance at survival. And once this chance was presented to them, who would choose to butt heads with the Jiangbei garrison? No one wanted to be the egg casting itself against the stone. On top of this, although Boss Suen, who had brought Chang'e and the others into the Shanghai gang, was brusque and bad-tempered, he was a sensible man and not one to act on impulse. Seeing the way the wind was blowing, he made an immediate decision to conceal Chang'e and Xuling's identities. Prince Yan dropping out of the sky with such a charged atmosphere wouldn't calm anyone. It would only incite the malcontents' rage. If some idiot lost their head and detained Prince Yan as a threat to the Jiangbei garrison, they would lose any chance of bringing the situation to a neat conclusion. Boss Sun's considerations were similar to Chang'e's. Neither wanted to offer the lives of these unfortunate people as fodder for the Jiangbei garrison's cannons, which ought to be pointed at the far westerners, just to make the government heed a desperate, exhausted cry for help. Thus, with Boss Suen's aid and abetment, Chang'e and Xuling maintained their guise as do-gooder merchants from the south. Liao Zhen, who had been mingling with the refugees in Jiangbei as he performed his monthly duty of delivering all living creatures from suffering, also happened to be among the Shanghai gang at the time. Leaning on his connections, Chang'e and Xuling had successfully made contact with the leadership of the rebel mob. Everyone knew Prince Yan possessed a silver tongue that could speak the language of saints and savages alike. Aside from its peculiar impotence against Gu Yuan, it was an extraordinary weapon. There was no one he couldn't hoodwink if he put his mind to it. Within the span of a month, Chang'e had more or less mastered the situation. Those who had been in an indignant fury when he arrived were able to sit down and weigh the pros and cons of potential actions after his intervention. The Shanghai gang had 4 bandit kings, including Boss Sun. Minus one thorny man who had an irreconcilable hatred for the government, Chang'e had managed to persuade the other 3 to attempt negotiation with the government before reckless action. It was then, however, that the Jiangbei garrison, which had been searching for Prince Yan in secret all this time, began to move in the open. The atmosphere again grew tense. Chang'e guessed the false Prince Yan must have reached the capital, and the entire plot had come to light. His disappearance in Yangzhou was now common knowledge. This matter involved a prince of the first rank. The Jiangbei garrison had no choice but to make their position clear and switch from covert to overt investigation. Chang'e found himself placating the Shanghai gang's rebel army on one side, while the other personally drafting a memorial imploring the Jiangbei garrison not to make any rash moves lest his plan fall apart on the cusp of completion. But storms gather out of even the clearest skies. When someone ran into a spate of bad luck, they were liable to get something stuck in their teeth even while drinking cold water. Nothing had gone as smoothly as planned for Prince Yan ever since he infiltrated the bandits' nest. When the Shanghai gang had begun to plot rebellion in earnest, they took after the crafty hare with 3 burrows and moved their main headquarters to a different location every half a month. At this point, the headquarters were located in the midst of a clump of hills in Jiangbei, backed against a mountain quarry. Such quarries weren't particularly rare in Jiangbei region, and had Chang'e had an astute artificer with him, they would have reminded him to take care. It was very likely that this type of terrain would pose a problem for wooden birds. It was not unheard of for mountain quarries to cause compasses and similar devices to malfunction. Despite the Lingyuan wooden bird's elegant exterior, its core was no more than a special magnet embedded in the creature's belly. The birds could avoid interference if they were already high in the air, but before these ones could be launched, a lap around the mountain quarries had caused the magnets in every wooden bird to fail. Since the birds couldn't get out, Chang'e was forced to resort to a cruder method, dispatching Liao Zhan to deliver the letter in person. The lone letter he had sent this way was precisely the one Gu Yuan's guard delivered to the capital. But things went awry yet again. None of the 4 rebel leaders had spent many days in school. Their aesthetic tastes were on the same basic level of old farmers who gathered in local city god temples to hear folk tales. They had named themselves after heaven, earth, humans, and ghosts, taking the titles Heaven King, Earth King, and so on, all exceedingly mortifying for their underlings to use. Boss Suen was the human king, and the Heaven King was the thorny one willing to commit every kind of cruelty to satisfy his deep ocean grudge against the government. This so-called Heaven King's words had originally held great sway. He'd had the whole gang ready to revolt with him when he was quite suddenly demoted from the big boss to an obstinate minority. After thinking carefully, he concluded that the human king was the one to blame. Boss Suen had never been willing to fight the Jiangbei garrison. Thus, the thorny fellow began nursing a grudge against the spineless coward, Boss Suen, and even bribed one of his enemy's confidants in an attempt to dig up some dirt against him and send him to an early grave. The bribed subordinate watched Boss Suen and his people like a hawk for the better part of a week, but failed to get anything on Boss Suen. However, by complete and utter coincidence, he did see Liao Zhan sneaking off in the middle of the night to liaise with government officials. "Huh, would you look at that? These good brothers of ours were dogs of the court all along," thought the Heaven King in outrage. Whatever scant bit of trust he had in them collapsed entirely. The moment Chang'e discovered that they had been exposed, he made a snap decision. He gathered all the people with any influence in the bandit gang and confessed his true identity before the Heaven King could interrogate them himself. Even if the timing was less than ideal, it was still a better option than allowing an outsider to incite the crowd by unmasking him. Of course, Chang'e could have killed the Heaven King, but the people of the Jianghu had their own ideas of justice. This rough-and-tumble bunch wouldn't carefully weigh the situation like court officials, and any slip-up would blow up in his face. At the Heaven King's provocation, the bandit nest erupted with furious accusations. Prince Yan pulled out a wood-carving knife and thunked it blade first into the table. "Let's follow the usual rule, then. 3 strikes, 6 holes. How many times should I stab myself to show my sincerity?" The vast majority were quelled by this, but one ferocious bandit decided to call his bluff. Emboldened by Chang'e's efforts, he grabbed the knife and stabbed Chang'e without another word. Chang'e knew there would be no getting out of this if he didn't take the blow. He didn't move. All the rebels, especially the rebel leader, were struck dumb by the sight of this first blood. They knew they couldn't under any circumstances allow His Highness Prince Yan to die in the hands of the Shanghai gang. In that case, they would have no choice but to rebel, and no choice but to die. There would be no more room for negotiation. The 3 remaining kings rushed to smooth things over, which only enraged the Heaven King further. He declared he would take his people and quit the Shanghai gang on the spot. With internal strife tearing the gang apart, the rebellion looked liable to end before it properly began. Boss Suen sent his men to escort Chang'e and his party away that night, fending off several attacks from the Heaven King's underlings along the way. Most of the men Boss Suan sent with him perished on the journey. Liao Zhen, whose skills in combat stopped at getting himself stuck inside a suit of heavy armor, was a little more than a burden. Xu Ling, meanwhile, was a burden through and through. For a martial expert, even throwing themselves into mortal danger alone was easier than fleeing for their life while hampered by 2 dead weights. Chang'eng was already injured. He hadn't been in such a sorry state in years. In protecting Commissioner Xu, he acquired yet another dangerous wound across his chest, so deep the flesh curled along the edges. It was only thanks to his training as half a disciple of Miss Chun that he managed to staunch the bleeding. Liao Zhen scooped some stream water into a leaf and offered it to Chang'eng, then produced some ointment and redressed Chang'eng's wounds. Chang'eng drank the water and sighed. He forced himself to alertness, and after gathering the energy to speak, patted the spot beside him. "Mingyu, come here, sit," he said to Xu Ling in a jovial tone. When the old man lost his horse, how was he able to know whether it was disaster or fortune? This may well be a blessing in disguise. Please, contain your grief until I've breathed my last. Xu Ling gracelessly used his sleeve to wipe his tears, apologies tumbling from his lips. "This lower official has dragged your highness down," he choked out through his sobs. Chang'eng chuckled. When the far westerners besieged our city, Mingyu Shong buckled down and secretly learned a foreign language. "What are you planning to do this time? Study martial arts until you can smash boulders against your chest?" Xu Ling blinked soggily at him. "Look, Great Master Liao Zhen isn't crying. He's perfectly calm." "This humble monk has never done a day's labor in his life," the monk shamelessly signed, "and has relied entirely on your highness's protection. I promised to light an everlasting altar lamp for your highness when we return and top up the oil every day as I pray." "You have my sincere thanks, Great Master. But if someone of your enlightened status prayed for me, I'm afraid I'd pay for the privilege with years off my life." Chang'eng struggled to find a more comfortable position. A bead of cold sweat slipped down his temple. He sucked in a few rapid breaths, then turned to Xu Ling. "About that rumor going around. Even the bandits in the Shanghai gang were discussing it. Yang Rongwei committed treason in my name. Our consciences are clear, and there's nothing they could have found to use against us. But it's best not to tie one's shoes in a melon field." He trailed off with a hiss of pain. "Great Master, you can't speak, but are your eyes also injured?" At this, the unobservant Liao Zhen hurried up with Xu Ling to support Chang'eng from both sides and help him turn over, carefully avoiding his wounds. It's best not to tie one's shoes in a melon field, lest one be taken for a thief. Chang'eng finally finished through the pain. "Now that it's come to this, we can't give up halfway. Rather than hurrying back to explain ourselves to His Majesty, we may as well stay and fix things here for good. Afterward, these minor injuries will give me an excuse to step out of the spotlight for a while." Watching blood seep through the freshly changed bandages on these so-called minor injuries, Xu Ling's admiration for Chang'eng reached unsurpassed heights. Perhaps even Master Feng Han back in the capital couldn't hold a candle to him now. He was about to sincerely profess his true feelings when a shift came over Liao Zhen's face and he held up a hand for quiet. He pressed his ear to the ground and after a moment signed to Chang'eng. "A few dozen riders are approaching on swift horses." "Whose people?" They had no way to tell whether the newcomers were General Zhong's men or the Heaven King's mad dogs. Bracing himself on Xu Ling's shoulder, Chang'eng struggled to his feet. Xu Ling was about to voice a shocked protest when Chang'eng cut him off. "Shh!" The easy mask he wore dropped away. His eyes gleamed, his narrowed gaze like that of an injured king of beasts, fangs poised to deliver a fatal bite even as its blood pooled across the ground. Veins stood out on the back of Chang'eng's pale hand as he stretched a long saber stolen from some unknown bandit's hand. There was no hint of weakness from his injury. Like this, his aura was all the more terrifying. Xu Ling couldn't help but hold his breath. Chang'eng suddenly cocked his head. A faint smile appeared on his dry, cracked lips. He tossed his saber aside and straightened the lapels of his disheveled clothes. "Go out. See which general is coming to meet us and welcome them in," he said to Xu Ling. "Extend them my invitation." "Your Highness, how do you know?" Xu Ling was shocked. Are the hoofbeats and footsteps of the Shanghai gang this orderly? It must be someone from the Jiangbei garrison. Chang'eng nonchalantly pulled his ratty outer robe to cover the grisly wound across his chest. Forgive me for my breach of etiquette. I have been feeling unwell, he said, as elegant as ever. Liao Zhen was speechless. It seemed Prince Yan was truly Marshal Gu's protege in acting skills as well. Xu Ling could have prostrated himself in worship of Chang'eng. At this point, if Prince Yan so much as farted, he would trust it unconditionally. He immediately left to carry out his instructions. Chang'eng felt for his leather sachet. In addition to pacifying fragrance, he also stored some emergency medicines inside. He extracted a hemp leaf with trembling fingers and tucked it into the palm of his hand. If he really couldn't withstand the pain, he would chew it as a last resort. Chang'eng declined Liao Zhen's proffered arm and levered himself to his feet using the saber as support. He heard Xu Ling outside. Your Highness, it's... Before he could finish, the newcomer had burst inside, accompanied by a horse's sharp whinny. Chang'eng stared. Striding toward him, silhouetted by the sun at his back, was someone who should have long returned to the capital, Gu Yun. Chang'eng's feet slipped. The saber clanged to the ground as he fell forward into Gu Yun's arms. Prince Yan, who had moments ago been the perfect image of the saying, striding leisurely through foul winds and bloody rain, suddenly embodied, felled by injury like the collapse of a mountain. The calm and confident king of beasts became a delicate and sickly kitten. With one arm draped limply over Gu Yun's shoulder, he murmured in a voice thin as gossamer, "Zushi, it hurts." Chapter 97. The Dust Settles. It was as if Chang'eng had expelled all the injuries and pain in his body with this brief utterance. He felt like he'd been hollowed out and nearly fainted on the spot. The instant he saw Gu Yun, his rock-solid spine turned to mush and drained away. He couldn't summon a spark of energy. Even so, he couldn't bear to close his eyes. He slumped against Gu Yun's shoulder and took a moment to gather himself, fingers unconsciously grasping at Gu Yun's clothes. Chang'eng had lost too much blood. His entire body felt cold, and the hint of warmth and familiar medicinal scent coming off Gu Yun sent him into a dazed recollection of their very first meeting. He nearly forgot where he was. "Is there any wine left?" he muttered. Xu Ling finally caught up and sprang into eager action. "Marshal, I can..." Liao Zhen, who had unfortunately heard everything, grabbed the bookish idiot before he could get any further. The great master was a man who stood across the threshold from the mortal dust of the world. He had been shocked stiff by the implications of that name he heard Prince Yan murmur in his half-conscious daze. Gu Yun said nothing. Holding Chang'eng securely in his arms, he lifted him into the carriage, a frown creasing his brow. "Send for a medic." He pulled out a water flask. When armies were moving to a forced march or heading out on far-off expeditions, the soldiers didn't carry pure water in their flasks. Instead, they would mix in a bit of salt. This was something they learned from itinerant merchants in the desert. Gu Yun let Chang'eng rest against him as he fibbed without blinking. "Here's your wine. Open your mouth." Chang'eng was only dazed, not completely insensible. If it hadn't been Gu Yun who showed up, perhaps he could have slaughtered his way through another band of bloodthirsty rebels. He cooperated and took a few sips before quietly chuckling. Liar. Lying was the least of it. Gu Yun was tempted to string him up and give him a sound beating. Maybe then Chang'eng would finally understand the adage, "Wealthy sons sit not beneath treacherous eaves." But when he finally laid eyes on the man himself, Gu Yun's heart ached so much his chest went numb. How could he possibly lash out at him? No matter what avalanches Prince Yan had caused when he was out and about, Gu Yun had never before seen him injured so grievously. He sat there, stiff and expressionless, for a good while before carefully pulling aside Chang'eng's lapels for a look. He was immediately hit with a thick stench of blood. Gu Yun's chest heaved, and for the first time in his life, his hands began to shake. Chang'eng seemed to sense his volatile mood. He had just gotten a taste of the benefits of pouting and acting spoiled. He wasn't about to stop now. Leaning into Gu Yun's ear to add fuel to the fire, he said, "I was scared I'd never see you again." Face drawn, Guyuan closed his eyes. His hands were surpassingly gentle as he concentrated all the burning heat of his rage on the tip of his tongue. "Forgive my poor eyesight," he said icily, "but I fail to see how the indomitable Prince Yan is frightened." Hidden within the carriage's curtains, Chang'eng nuzzled his cheek into the crook of Guyuan's neck, his voice muffled. "If I really died, the last word you said to me would have been, 'Out.' I wouldn't be able to rest in peace." Guyuan held his tongue. The man in his arms was like a detestable climbing vine, stretching out a fatal little tendril to poke at his heart again and again. Hoofbeats approached outside, and a man called out in a messenger's booming voice, "Sir, the medic is on his way." Chang'eng looked as if he was in agony, but was unwilling to show it. He sat unmoving and sucked in a slow and shallow breath, baring his alarmingly pale neck. Torn between anger and genuine concern, Guyuan leaned down with a gloomy look and gave Chang'eng a kiss fueled by burning fury in the shadow of the curtain. His lips landed as gently as a dragonfly skimming the surface of a pond, but the expression on his face was like that of a man hunting his worst enemy. Chang'eng's eyes flew open. His gaze, unfocused from the effort of remaining alert earlier, sharpened as he stared wide-eyed at Guyuan. Guyuan breathed into his ear. "You'll be explaining yourself later." He ripped the curtain open and yelled at the medic jogging toward them. "Hurry it up!" The medic had thought to dismiss any onlooker as he worked, but the instant he locked eyes with Guyuan, he shivered in fright. Even if he borrowed 2 extra sets of guts, he wouldn't have dared to chase Marshal Gu off. He had no choice but to steel himself, sweating beneath Guyuan's gaze and trembling with fright, and attend to the horrible pair of gash wounds marring Prince Yan's body. Chang'eng would never voice his pain to outsiders. He merely twitched when the clumsy army medic tugged on his wound while wrapping it in gauze. Guyuan's expression grew darker and darker. Suddenly, one of Chang'eng's ice-cold hands slid into Guyuan's palm beneath his loosened robes. He seemed to sense Guyuan's bad mood. Chang'eng didn't tighten his grip, but rested it there, maintaining contact as he snuck furtive glances in Guyuan's direction until the medic finished and left. Guyuan looked at Chang'eng. A bead of cold sweat slid down Chang'eng's forehead, dangling from the tip of his eyelashes. In the next blink, it rolled off, leaving Chang'eng's gaze misty behind a hazy sweat. In his youth, Chang'eng had been adept at acting spoiled. Now, he clearly wasn't just adept. He had practically perfected the art. Guyuan was helpless against him. If Chang'eng kept looking at him like that for another instant time, he might actually climb up and fetch him the stars in the sky. Resigned, he wrapped his fingers around Chang'eng's and tugged him further into his embrace. "Close your eyes," he said softly. Chang'eng obeyed without a word. With this venture, he'd quelled the chaos in Zhangbei like a sharp blade cutting through tangled hemp. A huge burden had lifted from his shoulders, and in that moment, he had not a single worry. With the sound of Guyuan's heart thumping steadily against his ear, he wouldn't have a single regret even if he died that very second. He fell asleep, fully content. The Shanghai gang, currently at war with itself, was no longer a threat. General Zhong had honored the promise he made Prince Yan and hadn't moved a single soldier. He wrote an earnest offer of peace to deliver to the Shanghai gang. Chang'eng had dispatched a good portion of the Heaven King's men, and the allied forces of the 3 bandit chiefs mopped up the rest. What had promised to be a bloody rebellion melted, just like that, into thin air. 3 days later, Yao Zhen arrived in Yangzhou. He had hastened from the Jiangbei garrison to serve as acting governor of Liangjiang, with full authority to manage matters in Jiangbei. His first act was to detain all remaining members of Yang Ronggui's party while he took his subordinates to track down the locations of the impoverished refugees. He freed each and every one of them, and after providing appropriate consolation, restarted the process of refugee documentation. He also specially assigned a group of officials to record and conduct searches for friends and family who had been separated. For those whose loved ones were found to have passed, he went in person to offer reparations. Several days later, A large shipment of medicine arrived from the imperial court. Li Feng issued an edict calling for a portion of Yang Ronggui's confiscated funds to be returned to the capital and assigned the rest to provide reparations for the refugees. The Ministry of Revenue would complete the paperwork retroactively in the coming days. Shuling recovered his position as imperial envoy and took charge of investigating the Yang Liu faction. In a brilliant display of his signature upright and incorruptible character, he cleanly stripped every inch of his target's home in search of evidence. But it was just as Yang Rongui said. His home hid very little gold, silver, or coin. All of it had been exchanged for war beacon tickets. At a loss, Xu Ling turned to Prince Yan for advice as the prince lay confined to his bed. I have a decent idea of how many war beacon tickets were distributed, and who bought them up. Chang'eng said, That young bastard isn't the one propping up the national treasury. Investigate his associates among the civilian merchants. They're likely colluding with the officials. If you don't understand the account books or can't tell which records are real, don't worry. I've got someone who can help, and he should be here in the next few days. He's the son of the god of wealth. He grew up holding an abacus. We are on good terms. He can be trusted. Shuling nodded again and again. There's one more thing. Chang'eng leaned back against the headboard and looked up, the contours of his eyes sharp and defined as if they had been carved with a knife, added a keen edge to his countenance that couldn't be erased even in the grip of his injury. The court has declared that war beacon tickets are equivalent to silver and gold, and many circulate among the people. The exchange rates are set. There's no reason they can't be used as disaster relief funds. So what's the problem here? Your Highness, Shuling said quietly, the second batch of war beacon tickets have recently been distributed, but few have purchased them. Aside from the officials in the imperial court, the civilians who buy them are mostly members of large families with a bit of wealth to their name. None of these are short on silver to spend, so most leave the war beacon tickets sitting in their homes like some sort of prize. The tickets rarely circulate on the market, so truthfully, I don't know whether merchants will accept them. Chang'eng braced a hand against the edge of the bed to push himself upright. I can't force people to spend them instead of stockpiling them in their homes, but refusing war beacon tickets as a legal tender is a serious crime. Starting tomorrow, inventory all the war beacon tickets in Yang Ronggui's estate and add them to your accounts. Use them to buy relief grain from the big grain merchants. I'd like to see if anyone dares treat the decrees of the court as scrap paper. Requisition some men from the Jiangbei garrison to accompany you. Do you understand? Xu Ling understood. Prince Yan was instructing him to act like a common hoodlum. Using Jiangbei as an example, they would force the nation to accept that these war beacon tickets spent the same as silver and gold. They would hit the big merchants first. As the saying went, those who bear shoes have more to fear than the barefooted. None of these shoe wearers wished to offend the court, so they would pinch their noses and capitulate. At that point, they'd either have to mutely eat their losses or find some way to turn these war beacon tickets into solid gold and silver by putting their full weight behind their implementation. Let's light another fire under them. Chang'eng was still weak, and his voice was low. Have Chong Zixiong issue this decree as the governor of Liangjiang. If any merchant, large or small, refuses to accept war beacon tickets, anyone can report them to the Yangzhou prefectural government. If the report is verified, they shall be served a beating. Any who persist after repeat infractions will be jailed. Xu Ling had been treated to a thorough demonstration of His Highness Prince Yan's methodology, conciliatory when the situation necessitated conciliation, and severe when the situation necessitated severity. He hurriedly assented and ran off to get to work. But before he reached the door, Chang'eng called after him, Mingyu. When Xu Ling turned, the stern look had dropped from Chang'eng's face. Within the blink of an eye, he was once more the graceful and elegant Prince Yan. I'll be counting on you from now on. What do you mean by this, Your Highness? Xu Ling was mystified. I'm afraid I'll be delayed here for some time, Chang'eng said. I won't be able to return to the capital and debrief this mission with you, but I do have a memorial I'd like you to deliver to His Majesty on my behalf. For a while now, Chang'eng had been pressing forward without pause. It was time to step back. He had to control his tempo, and his injuries were a perfect excuse to relinquish some of his power. Unfortunately, the straightforward Commissioner Xu clearly missed his point. He clasped his hands together in a very proper bow and said, "Of course, Your Highness's injuries are severe. You should take care of yourself and recuperate. I'll handle all the legwork. If there is anything I don't understand, I'll be sure to ask for clarification." Chang'eng chuckled. Shuling was hopeless. He left it at that and waved him off. On his way out, Shuling ran into the Marquis of Anding on his way in. He snapped to attention to greet him. Guyuan nodded politely. As the man brushed past him, Shuling started in surprise. Guyuan was holding a fresh spring of osmanthus blossoms tucked behind his back. The flowers bloomed a golden yellow, their sweet scent thick in the air. Shuling watched blankly as the marshal carried that spray of flowers into Prince Yan's room, rubbing his perfume-filled nose in shock. Marshal Gu really is so attentive to His Highness. Guyuan stepped inside and hung the flowering branch in Chang'eng's bed curtain. The osmanthus are blooming. I didn't want you to feel too cooped up lying inside. Is the scent okay? Chang'eng's gaze attached itself to Guyuan and refused to tear itself away. Guyuan met his eyes. What are you looking at? Chang'eng reached out to tug at his clothes. Worried he'd strain his wounds, Guyuan hurriedly cooperated and leaned down. Don't flail around. Chang'eng's pull was insistent, gripping Guyuan's robes and drawing him close. Zushi, it hurts. After a lengthy pause, Guyuan said expressionlessly, Get out of here. I'm not falling for that anymore. Since his injury, it seemed Prince Yan had no intention of preserving any dignity around Guyuan. Whenever they were alone, he'd pipe up with an, It hurts, kiss me, any chance he got. But bad habits, if indulged, could only get worse. This piece of wisdom always held true. Guyuan flicked his forehead with a finger, then turned to go change. Chang'eng stared until he disappeared behind the folding screen. He plucked a tiny osmanthus blossom and carefully chewed it between his teeth. Then, grabbing a wooden cane from the bedside, he rose to stand. Chang'eng slowly edged his way to the table, not quite able to straighten his waist. He dipped his brush in a small pool of leftover ink and spread a sheet of paper to begin his memorial. This was a physically demanding task for an invalid, and his forehead soon beaded with sweat. Suddenly, someone snatched his brush from behind. Chang'eng had barely started to turn when an insistent pair of hands grabbed him out of the chair and hauled him straight back to the bed. Is the sky falling? Do you have to write it yourself? Guyuan snapped. Lie down and behave yourself. The Liu family and their entire faction are implicated in this case, Chang'eng calmly explained. The Feng family hasn't gotten off scot-free either. It's the perfect time to push new policies. Even if I'm not acting in the open, I have to be prepared. Guyuan sat beside the bed. Are you still considering special permits for violet gold usage? His Majesty will never agree. It's not that, Chang'eng said. The time's not right. But the confiscated lands along the canal can be used to resettle the refugees. The most fertile land can be reserved for agriculture and the rest used to build factories. Master Du and his Chamber of Commerce can split the construction's costs half and half with the court. And the factories won't be the property of civilian merchants. They'll be officially run by the government. We can establish a dedicated department under the Grand Council, separate from the 6 ministries, to manage the allotment of violet gold and keep its distribution under strict control. Meanwhile, the Chamber of Commerce will be in charge of day-to-day operations. 60% of the profits will go directly to the national coffers, 40% to the merchants running the factory operations. This way, we can resettle the refugees without worrying His Majesty with leakage of violet gold. We can revitalize the national treasury at the same time and provide incentives for altruistic merchants. What do you think? Guyuan didn't say anything for a long time after listening to this speech. It was obvious that Chang'eng had gone through countless drafts of this plan. He must have thought of it even before he came to Zhangbei. If he had brought it up then, he would have essentially pulled a giant pile of lucrative jobs out of thin air. All the noble families would have been champing at the bit for a piece of the pie. Yang Rongwei and his ilk were not above snatching disaster relief funds to pad their own coffers. This level of profiteering was far from beneath them. In the end, this plan, intended to address a laundry list of problems, would have solved none of them. The national treasury wouldn't see a cent. The merchants would be hampered by the complex bureaucracy between major and minor court officials, and the refugees driven like livestock. Only the maggots would see their pockets stuffed. It was for this reason that Chang'e had deliberately intensified the conflict between the established nobles and the young upstarts in court, then used a convenient excuse to travel to Jiangbei and muddy the waters further. He drove a wedge between the deeply interconnected noble families and let them dig their own graves, then sat back and watched them brazenly flout the law. He advanced and arrayed his pieces, then retreated behind the curtain after a smooth endgame, removing himself from the spotlight. A few unexpected complications had arisen in the middle, but when all was said and done, he had achieved every one of his objectives. Chang'e blinked. What is it? Guyuan pulled his wandering thoughts back and smiled. If I didn't know better, I'd think you were really some evil demon sent from the heavens. His words seemed like a non sequitur, but Chang'e somehow grasped his meaning. He scooted over to Guyuan and clung to his shoulder. Would you believe if I said that the fate of Great Liang rises and falls with me? When Guyuan turned to answer, Chang'e picked the exact right moment to topple forward. Guyuan's lips brushed against his cheek. You kissed me. Guyuan had no words. Weren't they talking politics? Chang'e looped his arms around Guyuan's neck, insistent as he forced that mouthful of osmanthus fragrance between Guyuan's lips. Guyuan had no objections to fragrant beauties throwing themselves into his arms. Unfortunately, at times like these, His Highness Prince Yan absolutely refused to behave and play the part of the fragrant beauty. Romantics spoke of how a beauty's lips and tongue were sweet as honey, the taste of a beloved the finest delicacy in the world. Those who sample their fragrance ought to start shallow before plunging deep, savoring every note. Chang'e, however, never cooperated. Even if he began obediently, his ferocious nature would surface within moments. Kissing him was less like an intimate moment of passion and more like he was trying to devour Guyuan alive. Guyuan felt this delicacy was a bit abrasive on the mouth. When the two finally parted, the tip of his tongue had gone numb. But still, Chang'e wasn't satisfied. Mesmerized, he ran his teeth lightly over Guyuan's jaw and neck, as if looking for a place to bite, for all the world like he wanted to swallow him, blood and bone. Guyuan instinctively froze at the sensation of his vulnerable neck being assessed as a chew toy, but he wasn't willing to push Chang'e away. Tense and ticklish at once, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Were you bitten by a dog when you were younger? Chang'e's gaze was searing. The prohibition Miss Chun set for me is almost over, right? All right, everyone. That concludes the reading of the first 3 chapters in Arc 13, Government Reforms. And yeah, I'm pretty satisfied thus far. Glad to know that, of course, Chang'e is okay. And it was so cute to see Guyuan finally experience what Chang'e experienced when he got hurt. So yeah, and also, does anyone else find Shuling adorable in just his pure wholesomeness? And initially when he went on this trip with Chang'e, of course he was 100% ready to take down Chang'e if he found out that he was corrupted essentially. But upon seeing that no, Chang'e really has a good heart and wants what's best for the people, for the kingdom of Great Liang, now he's just like his biggest supporter. That's so adorable. Anyway, I will see you all next time for the next 3 chapters. I hope you have a lovely day or a wonderful night, and wo ai ni men.